we go, awesome. And obviously, thank you so much to RSA for the opportunity and privilege. My name is Rick Derbyshire. I'm a senior security researcher at Orange Cyber Defense.
And I'm Charles van der Walt. I'm head for security research at Orange Cyber Defense. You can tell that Rick and I work for the same company because we're wearing these attractive matching t-shirts. And Rick is going to be as surprised as the rest of you to hear this, but what we're going to do is at the end of this session, because we know it's very early, Rick is going to be taking his shirt off and then signing it and giving it to the person that asked the best question. So stay tuned, it's going to be an exciting session. But on a slightly more serious note, we were in a session yesterday with Josh Corman. I don't know if you guys follow him. He has that I Am the Cavalry initiative. And Josh had a workshop with some members from CISA, other government leaders, the ransomware task force, and they're concerned about the imminent threat that a cyber attack will result in the loss of life in the USA, and particularly in critical industries like health, water, power, etc. And so our purpose with this talk today is to share with you some thoughts we have about what the state of security in OT is as it stands now, what the real threat looks like, to speculate a little bit about why we think it is like that, and then to present to you a vision of a future threat that we think could dramatically change the state of OT security. It's a concept, it's a model that we want to share with you, in which we demonstrate that it is possible for an attacker to hold an entire operational or an industrial facility to ransom. If we think clearly and precisely about what the problem is, we think it can be done. And we're going to demonstrate to you how we think it can be done. So this talk is going to be a mix between some concepts, and then we're going to drill down deeper and deeper into the detail until eventually Rick is going to show us how, with live demos or semi-live demos, how that could be achieved. Terms and conditions apply. I think we're all here because we share this concern that the threat in the OT space is escalating. And if, like me, you're paying attention, then you will have seen stories like this about oil refineries being shut down, apocalypse in the power grid. I can't remember what the other one is. Our factories going AWOL. Right? This is what we see every day in the news. Except we don't, actually, right? We don't see stories like this in the news. Now, I'm guessing you're in this room because you have the sense, right, that the OT threat is escalating. There's a lot of narrative around it, like vendors are talking about it, the analysts are talking about it. But if we actually look at the data, which Rick very bravely did, we see a very clear picture emerging in the OT space. Now, what this very beautiful chart represents is a study of 35 years of incidents, cyber incidents, publicly reported cyber incidents, in which OT was impacted. And we looked at who the actor was, we looked at the kinds of tools and techniques they were using, and we looked at where in the Purdue model the impact was eventually felt. I always get this wrong. Is that
where the attackers got to?
How far the attacker got in the Purdue model. And it's sort of broken up in 5-year increments. If you start at the bottom, you go up towards today. What we see is, firstly, between 85 and 2000, very few attacks are reported. Right? There's like half a dozen a year. And there's a significant number of them that are attributed to state and hacktivist actors. And a significant number of them are reaching low down in the Purdue model, right? Like down to the industrial control level. And then in 2020, between 2020 and today, something very dramatic happens. Firstly, the volume of these incidents just skyrockets, right? Look at that big blue band at the top there. It's just a whole new level of attacks. But the actor also changes. Now, of course, state actors are still in there, hacktivists are still in there, but overwhelmingly what we're seeing is criminals who are responsible for these attacks. These criminals are using IT tools and IT techniques, and they're impacting high in the Purdue model. Basically, they're only reaching IT. And what we're seeing there corresponds exactly with the emergence of double extortion and ransomware as a service. Because what this data tells us is that what we're seeing when we hear about attacks against factories, when we hear about operations being shut down, when we hear about Colonial Pipeline not being able to pipe oil, what's actually happening is that cyber criminals are performing ransomware attacks against the IT of these enterprises, and that's having a secondary effect. That's having a knock-on effect that's impacting OT. Now again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that these other more sophisticated technical attacks are not happening or they're not a threat. But our area of interest, this big band at the top, really sparked our interest. And we started thinking to ourselves, like, why is that happening? Why is it, if OT is so much less secure than IT, and just about any way you think about it, it must be, right? IT's got 30 years of security history. OT's got about 30 days of security history. So it must be less secure, but yet it's not the OT that's being attacked. It's the IT that's being attacked. And one of the ways we can examine that question is by applying some other research that Rick and I have access to in the realm of criminology. And in the realm of criminology, there's these models or frameworks that help you discern or predict when and why crime will happen. And one beautiful old model is called routine activity theory. Routine activity theory dates back to like the 70s. If you look at the pictures of these old codgers, Cohen and Felsen, they're sort of shuffling through the halls of academia. And they presented this very simple principle that, despite its age, has really kind of stood the test of time. It's still very popular as a way of thinking about crime. And what it says is that crime exists, crime is likely when three factors coexist, when three factors converge. The first is you need to have an offender. Some call it the likely offenders, others call it the motivated offender. But there's a person who is sufficiently motivated to take the risk of performing a crime. Next, you have to have a suitable victim. Now, suitability, we'll come back to this, suitability in a victim are attributes of the victim. So the victim has assets, the victim is available, the victim is visible, the victim is vulnerable in some way, but there must be a victim. And then thirdly, there needs to be the absence, the lack of a guardian. And Cohen and Felsen describe the guardian as maybe a formal function like the police or security services, maybe informal functions like nosy neighbors, that lady's always peering over the fence like, hey, what are you doing here? She could be a guardian. Or mostly in IT, when we talk guardians, then we're talking technology, right? And Cohen and Felsen, they make provision for that also. So when you have a suitably motivated offender, a suitably visible and vulnerable target, and there's no guardian, then there's a very high probability that crime will occur. And if we examine cybercrime in the OT space, then we see that those two things are already there, right? I made the comment right up front that OT is probably not very well secured, right? The technical guardians are not there. We don't have it. We know the targets are there because those businesses are being hit more than any other. In all our other data sets, manufacturing businesses constitute 25% of all victims. And they have for like the last for the last 5 years. So we know the businesses are suitable targets. So what's left to examine is, why is the attacker not motivated? Why is the criminal not motivated to attack OT systems? And the simple answer to that is ROI, return on investment. And there's two elements to that. The first is that right now, the ROI in IT hacking and what we would call ransomware is very good, right? They're just winning over and over again. It's like, owning a slot machine. The money is pouring out of cyber extortion. And there would be a technical cost to adopt the skills and build the capabilities that would be required to effectively target OT, as opposed to IT. But perhaps more importantly, the reason cybercrime evolves is generally not because of developments in cyber. It's because of developments in crime. It's because of innovation in crime that cybercrime evolves. And what we've been dealing with for the last 5 years is probably the most effective cybercrime business model we've ever seen, in the form of ransomware, or maybe more accurately, cyber extortion, right? That's the crime. That's why they're making the money, because they're able to take something from the victim, hold it to ransom, present a clear and present threat, extort payment, and then return that thing to the victim. Right? Those are the key factors. And until those key factors can be translated into OT, we're not going to see that crime going across. And OT doesn't lend itself to encryption and data exfiltration. It's not the same kind of thing as IT. So if we look at what we call the cyber extortion kill train, we specifically call it cyber extortion because we want to emphasize that the crime is extortion. The crime is not making ransomware or deploying ransomware. Then the kill chain technically looks very much like what we've been looking at for years, right? It's the traditional Lockheed Martin kill chain. You know, results vary, but it's basically the same thing. You have reconnaissance, intrusion, there's some internal reconnaissance, lateral movement, some privesc. Then we have to establish command and control. And then right down there at point number 6, we get to the actions on target. What is the attacker doing once they're in the environment? And there are 3 key ingredients to any successful cyber extortion attack in IT. You want to exfiltrate the data, right? That's where the second lever comes from, the threat of data leakage. You want to destroy the backups. Why? Because if you destroy the backups, then you as the criminal own the only existing copy of that asset, and then you want to encrypt the machines. And now the attacker, the ransomware actor holds all the cards, and he can now move, or she can move, into what's really the point of all of this, which are those 7 elements on the right. The 7 elements on the right is why all of this is happening. The criminal needs to be able to make a threat, demand payment, demonstrate proof of life, demonstrate proof of life, pressure and negotiate, accept payment and return, and they need to be able to do this systematically over and over again. And if they fail in any one of these elements, the crime fails, and if the crime fails too many times, the threat is no longer taken seriously, right? So for example, you don't return the data or you don't give out the keys, then this model starts to fail.
So we came up with some criteria that we thought were necessary to be present in order to actually extort an OT environment. So what Charles said in terms of the cyber extortion kill chain, it kind of ended with encryption at the end. And that doesn't really work, and we're going to talk through that in the context of this as well. So the first criterion that we need to have is scalability. And if we're going to do something, for example, like encrypting a programmable logic controller, a PLC, you're going to need root access to that PLC. And there's a severe amount of diversity among just single victims, but also across the entire user base of operational technology as well. So you're going to need exploits for vulnerabilities, not only in specific ecosystems, but for individual PLCs, but also for individual firmwares for those PLCs. And all of a sudden we start to see you're going to need a lot of essentially cyber to be able to start encrypting these PLCs, so it's not a scalable issue. It needs to be stable as well. If we go and do some sort of smash and grab and just basically break the operational technology to begin with and say you can only have it back if you pay us, that's not going to be an incentive for the victim, because they're just going to just replace everything, because that's probably going to be less costly than paying for the potential unreliable ransom payment. So on that stability, because we want to leave the operational environment intact while we're actually doing it and stable, we also need a credible threat of what happens if they don't pay or if they try and recover from the attack. So we need to be able to have optimized consequences such that if they do try and either weather the timeout or they try and recover the environment, we actually do something that's going to not only just cause damage and turn things off, but seriously cause a threat to their organization and the future of their organization. We also want to detect tampering, and that kind of sounds a bit strange. But for example, if we go back to the encryption example, if you did manage to encrypt a PLC, typical response and recovery practices in an engineering environment are quite resilient to that kind of attack. They would just rip the PLC off the wall, they'd put a new one on, and they'd essentially just like re-upload the configuration. Kind of like big boy Lego, it's kind of like replaceable. We want to prevent recovery, which is kind of like an obvious thing. We don't want them to be able to get away from our attack, so we need to be able to make sure that it's resilient in the face of the victim trying to reverse any changes. And finally, the most crucial thing is being able to disarm on payment, because we don't want to, I mean, we're criminals, right? But we're honorable criminals. So we want to be able to actually give the environment back to them. We want them to have some sort of trust in us despite us extorting them for a lot of money.
So if we can pull those things off, then we have the opportunity to conduct the crime of extortion in an OT environment. If we look at the data, we feel that's a game changer, right? Now criminals have got a reason to attack OT. Of course, for nation-state actors, hacktivists, this is an equally attractive proposition, right? And so what we want to do is we want to introduce to you Deadman's PLC, which is our concept, a technical concept of how this attack could be realized in an actual OT environment. And we're going to talk you through the model, the thinking behind it. We're going to talk to you about how it works, and then we're going to show you why and that it works. And again, I'm going to steal Rick's thunder here. But Rick is going to introduce the concept of conveyor.exe. And you know how it works in a hacking presentation, right? If you want to demonstrate that you've pulled an attack off, what do you have to do as a presenter? Come on, you guys have been here for days. What do? You pop calc. You pop calc.exe, right? So the new thing is now if you want to demonstrate that you can compromise an OT environment, you have to mess up a conveyor belt, right? And we're calling that conveyor.exe. All right, so the kill chain for Deadman's PLC looks pretty much exactly like the kill chain for cyber extortion, with really differences in only 3 phases. To phase 2, we're interested particularly in identifying and compromising an engineering workstation. In phase 4, we're interested in terms of reconnaissance, not to understand where computers are, which is phase 3. Sorry, we're interested in understanding not where the computers are, but we're understanding what the logic is that runs this industrial environment. The better we understand the inner workings of the industrial environment, the more acutely we can target what we would call like a malicious consequence, right? To make actually bad things happen in the OT environment rather than just making things reboot. And finally, in phase 6, instead of encrypting, destroying backups, and exfiltrating data, we're going to aim to put ourselves using Deadman's PLC in a position where we can actually pursue what our criminal intent is, which is to establish a realistic threat, demand payment, demonstrate proof of life, and return that stolen asset once payment is made. But in this case, what we're aiming to do is to ransom the entire environment, not individual computers within it, but the whole shebang. Is it still me?
No, it's me now. Cool. So as Charles mentioned, we're going to talk about how it works first, which will be kind of just an introduction to a model. We'll show some screenshots of our proof of concept implementation, but then we'll get into the why it works, because we want you to be healthily skeptical about this. And so we'll show you how the proof of concept works after that as well, with some cool animations and videos. So we're going to focus on Deadman's PLC as part of that cyber kill chain. Is that what it was? Cyber extortion kill chain. So the 3 parts that deviate from that are the intrusion, positioning, and threat model, the internal reconnaissance and preparing Deadman's PLC, and then finally deploying and arming Deadman's PLC. So let's begin with the intrusion, positioning, and threat model. Now, we start at the engineering workstation as part of the threat model, and that may sound like we're already starting with a bit of science fiction, but Sands and Nozomi did a study a couple of years ago that revealed that of all of the attacks that actually impacted operational technology, 34.7% of attacks stemmed from the engineering workstation. And from the data that we've looked at as well and that we've collected and analyzed, it's just true that no adversaries are really finding it difficult to get to that point. So we decided to just kind of do away with the anything before that. Once they're at the engineering workstation, they're kind of positioned to start messing with things. So let's get going. So obviously the next thing is the internal reconnaissance and preparing it. So here we are on our engineering workstation, and we're going to be building this model and kind of going through there diagrammatically. And the first thing we want to do is identify and validate the current PLC project. So we're going to be using engineering principles here rather than necessarily cybersecurity principles. We're doing this from the ground up as an operational technology attack, not cyber attack. I'm going to mention as well, we're going to be using the Siemens ecosystem for the screenshots and everything like that. Other ecosystems and vendors do apply. We just like Siemens and work with Siemens. It's not that they are particularly vulnerable to this. It's just what we did for our proof of concept. So if you're from Siemens, I'm very sorry. So the first thing we want to do is essentially, while we're on the engineering workstation, we have the crown jewels. And we want to basically work out what's going on the PLCs. So if you can see the green ticks in the screenshot, that basically means that that code is the live code in that project that is running on the PLCs right now. So we're already happy and we know where we are. So we take our engineering workstation, and the next thing that we know is that those PLCs exist. We know that we can have access to them because we can see that through the project file, and we know that that is the code that is currently running on them, so we're very happy. So the next thing to do is identify pre-existing PLC to PLC relationships. So in the operational environment, they're going to be talking to one another sometimes. So what we want to do is, again, this is just from our proof of concept, so don't worry about the specificities of the screenshots. But we want to work out what we are building upon in terms of communications and what we may have to add in the future. So we have, again, a nice little model, and then just for, this isn't accurate for the model or anything like that, this is just basically saying we know some relationships now exist. And the next thing we want to do is identify the core code blocks that are running on the PLCs that are basically doing the legitimate work of the operational environment. Now, this isn't just what's running in terms of at the time. We also have to be prepared, because we want to stay stable. We want to be prepared that if there are any interrupts or anything like that, that we basically account for that. So we want to keep things stable, we want to keep things running. So with our model, we know while it's running, we can keep things happy, but when we need to get angry, we can make things get angry. And that's it for reconnaissance and the preparation in that kind of phase. So we now need to deploy an ARM Deadman's PLC. The first thing to want to do is introduce a covert monitoring network, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's basically just the PLC is going to talk to one another. So we have our model at the moment, and we have some relationships between the engineering workstation and the PLCs, but we're going to take that away because that's now not necessary. We want to start building our own thing. And the first thing that we do is we build in a heartbeat system. And this is where the concept of the dead man's switch comes from, which is why we called it dead man's PLC. So what the heartbeat does, the Snap 7, I just want to point out, for the engineering workstation, for the Siemens ecosystem, Snap 7 is a Python library that we use to also communicate between the PLCs. So the heartbeat system basically means that every single entity that is under attack is talking to one another as a heartbeat. And what that means is that there's malicious accountability and a one-to-one relationship in everything in the attack. So that means, for example, there's a sender and there's a receiver for every heartbeat. If the receiver doesn't receive a heartbeat, that means it knows that the sender has been tampered with. And conversely, if the sender cannot send a heartbeat, it knows that the receiver has been tampered with. Now that's only in a one-to-one relationship, so that's not really that useful. So what we do is also we put in alerting, so all the PLCs are going to snitch on each other, right? And what that means is that if the network does detect any tampering, and we're going to get into the types of scenarios of tampering in a minute, but if there are any tampering, the PLCs will then set themselves to an alert state. And then the other PLCs and the other entities in the environment that were under our attack will check everything else as alert state. And then this alert will propagate out. And then that can mean that the attack then needs to actually ensue the consequences. So what we have here is our model with just 3 PLCs and engineering workstation for an example. So then we have our heart beating in, and also then we have our alerting in. And then the next thing we need to do is prevent the introduction of recovery devices. So it's not just that we have to worry about PLCs being taken out, it's also the concept that an engineer may come in and try and plug a laptop into a single PLC, a switch or whatever. So basically what we do is as we arm the attack, which we'll get onto later, it's quite simple. We also baseline the number of connections that each PLC currently has at the time. And if that connection just simply increases, then we set the alert state that I've just mentioned. So basically, we're watching out for any programming devices being introduced, and then we then start the PLCs snitching on each other if that is the case. So then we need to introduce a payment time limit. And one of the key features of any cyber extortion is the pressure. So obviously, if everything's stable at the moment, it needs to not be stable forever in order to introduce the pressure. So this is quite simple. What we do is we just introduce a time limit on everything. It's really quite simple. The concept is literally the time counts down, and we start introducing some sort of pressure to the victim. Next, we need to have the credible threat. So we need to introduce the code that's going to disrupt the process. And there's a few ways that this works. So the first thing is, you may be familiar from what I showed before, that top screenshot is also the legitimate code that we had running. What we'll do is if there's an alert state set, we will disable the legitimate code, and then we will enable the malicious code that we will bake in. Now, the malicious code is extremely sensitive to whatever environment you're in, like no one size fits all in that kind of situation. In our example, all we did is just, for conveyor.exe, we just put sets and resets, like on or off, basically, to specific things. However, we are on the engineering workstation, so we can develop really good process comprehension, and we can really understand the physical process from that vantage point. And then we can really optimize the damage that we do to the physical environment. So here we actually are in the position to really, really present a proper, credible threat to the victim. So that means that once the alert is triggered, the heartbeats stop, the alerts all propagate out, and then we enact the consequences that we've been threatening. And next, we want to prevent the victims from reversing any changes. Now, this is kind of like a potential controversial point, because we're basically going to use the own password functionality against the victims. And this sounds like really weird from a cybersecurity perspective. Everyone's going, well, surely they have passwords. That's really stupid if they don't. But they don't. So if you're working particularly in something like a geographically dispersed environment, it's very difficult to manage those passwords with joiners, movers, and leavers. So typically, the passwords are just forgotten about. It's more of security by obscurity. People aren't going to like break into a water treatment site that's in a remote environment and start logging onto PLCs. Of course they're not, because they're not going to do something like this. So as well as all of the attack resilience that we've built in already, we also just password protect everything and just make sure that they cannot get to their own devices. This isn't necessary, but it's also a fun functionality. So we have nice little padlocks and everything to visually represent that. And then finally, we need to arm Deadman's PLC, which actually is far more simple than everything else. But the first thing to remember is we are only building a configuration right now. So we take those away because they don't exist right now. And then the final thing that we do is we just enter basically a function that basically says, start everything working when we tell you to. So then we send out Deadman's PLC on top of the existing code, reconfigure the PLCs, and then we have our alerting and then heartbeats and everything, and we are ready to basically start saying, hey guys, you're in trouble. You're going to pay us a lot of money.
All right, so let's just review. The goal here is to put ourselves in a position where we can extort a ransom. We're going to do that not by controlling individual PCs, but by controlling the entire environment. And we do that not by compromising the PLCs, but by infecting the code that's running on those PLCs. And in doing that, we can achieve a few things. The first is that we can achieve a meaningful impact on the environment should we choose. Because on each PLC, we can enumerate what its functionality is. What's it turning on? What's it turning off? What's it supposed to be measuring, right? That's the thing that we impact. The second thing is we can keep the environment running, right? The original code, our code runs underneath the original code. So the environment for all intents and purposes is just carrying on while all of this is happening. But then we need to be able to ensure that they can't take us out of there, right? We can't give up control. And that's why we set up this network of malicious accountability. I love that word. We set up this network of malicious accountability where all the infected devices are watching each other so that if one is tampered with, if anything in that environment is changed, the PLCs themselves detect that. And they send a message out like an alert, an alarm function. When that message goes out, each of the PLCs does the bad thing it was programmed to do, which is then specific to the cyber-physical device that it's connected to. So let's demonstrate why that becomes a meaningful threat. The first scenario, of course, is that we've now armed Deadman's PLC. The code, the modified code has been put out. We've set the active bit. And now these two layers of communication are happening. The first is the heartbeat. Every PLC is checking that its neighbor is still there, right? If a neighbor disappears, that triggers an alert. And then the second thing that happens is that these alarms get propagated out. It's kind of like ants in a, what is the collective noun for ants? Swarm, herd. It's like a herd of ants, right? The herd of ants, they communicate by sending messages to each other, right? And so the PLCs send messages to each other saying, I've detected an anomaly, dead man switch, and each one executes whatever its malicious payload is, which, as I said, is unique then to its function.
So we're going to show you a video, but first I have to say that in England we call it a colony of ants.
A colony of ants.
So South Africa is very exotic, though. So
it's a herd of fish.
Herd of fish, right? Okay, that makes sense. Obviously. So I want to. Playing videos at a conference is really quite scary because I'm going to have to talk at the right time. So I'm going to explain a couple of things before I do. What we have here is the whole main screen is TIA Portal, which is the configuration software for Siemens. And then the small command prompt is essentially our Snap7 attack. That is the engineering workstation attack. We've kind of just put it all in one place and stuff just to make it nice and simple. Let's press play. So this is just showing that first scenario. We've already uploaded the config, we enable it. The second window that pops up every time in the video, which we regretted, is essentially the payment window. We're not going to use that until later on. And then what we can see in both scenarios here is that the heartbeats are going and there are no alerting. So we have in TIA Portal at the top, you can see the first, I knew it was going to do that. Let's just go like randomly throughout the video. Cool. And also what we can see is the variables. So we have at the very top is the green box that says true, it's Deadman's PLC being enabled. And then we've got a few variables that show the various heartbeats and alerts that are going through on the 3 devices that we're actually using. Then finally we have at the bottom 2, which is the timer, the second, which is the penultimate one. And then the final one is the connection devices on one of the devices that we're monitoring. This is what's called a watch table. So throughout the environment, we've just basically chosen to look at certain variables that are across all the PLCs.
Right, so at this point, again, the environment is operating exactly as before, except that our PLCs are now talking with each other and making sure that none gets tampered with. And each PLC is now configured with a specific action that it will execute on command when the alert flag is set. And the first scenario is very simply, if one of these PLCs drops out, so the engineer's like, oh, there's something wrong with this, let's take it out, we're going to replace it, we're going to reflash it. As soon as that happens, it ceases to respond to its heartbeat. Its neighbors notice that, and they send out the alarm across the herd, across the colony.
Herd of PLCs.
And at that point, a herd of PLCs, yeah. At that point, each of those remaining PLCs now does the bad thing that it was designed to do.
So we finally get to introduce you to conveyor.exe. And we didn't do this in a real physical environment. Frankly, factory.io, the software that you use, is just much more fun to use. So this is conveyor.exe. And we'll just kind of go through the video as is. So everything's working fine. It does kind of speed up. It's just a weird frame rate to start with. Everything is working fine at conveyor.exe land. The entry conveyor is working fine. The robot is moving things, and then the exit conveyor is moving everything off. We enable Deadman's PLC just as before, and we move the payment window to the side because in this scenario, the victim doesn't pay. But what happens if they go, oh no, we're not going to be a victim to this. We'll just pull out the PLCs. So they go and try and do that. And watch me mistime that, of course. A few more heartbeats. Oh no, sorry. We also want to show that stability is one of the most important criteria. So we're showing that while it's enabled, the environment is still, in fact, stable. But now the victim decides, hey, everything's stable, so we'll just pull out a PLC. And that's our demo box. That's my little hand pulling out a PLC. And then that PLC is unreachable. Everything else sends the alert. The alerts go in TIA Portal. It propagates out. And we wait for some reason. And then we go and see that conveyor.exe is having a very, very bad time right now. The robots just stopped working. Factory.io doesn't really like us speeding the conveyor really fast. We wanted to like shoot things off, but it's not really built for doing cyber attacks against it. But yeah, so that's as fast as it will go, unfortunately. But everything is going wrong, I can assure you. Cool.
Right, so the other is, of course, that we need to have this, we need to put pressure on the victim so that they pay us the money. So we run a timer, and when the time runs out, exactly the same principle applies. We send alerts out across the network, and the PLCs all pull the dead man switch. What's cute about this is that the timer runs individually on each PLC. So whichever one hits 0 first is going to trigger that state. You know, if the engineering workstation wasn't there, for example, at this point, it's a self-managing, I suppose, botnet of maliciously infected PLCs.
Cool. Back over to conveyor.exe. Again, everything is running fine. We'll show kind of everything working as it should be every scenario. So conveyor.exe is just happily moving boxes. We enable Deadman's PLC, and also we move the payment window out of the way because we're going to run out of time. Just quickly as well, we only set a 10-second timer. We did that before realizing how fast I was going to have to speak, so it's already going. Conveyor.exe is working stably because we said that was one of the most important criteria, and we've got 2 seconds left. Boom. Whew. The alert has been raised because the timer ran out, and conveyor.exe, again, it's having an absolutely terrible time, and those poor little boxes are falling off.
Right, then the next scenario, of course, which is essential and I think underestimated in extortion attacks, is that you must be able to give the thing back. And it's a very subtle point, but think about it. If the first thing the attacker does is to destroy your factory, what is the value of that to the attacker? Right? Where do they get their leverage? How do you and even in the political realm, destroying something is a very sort of rapid escalation of conflict. Being able to threaten to destroy something is a much more interesting idea, right? But that means we need to be able to reverse out of that if the victim does concede to our demands, whatever those are. So in this case, the demand is $, the victim pays, and we simply flip a switch inside of those value tables that we were looking at, saying, okay, back out, the code disables, and the environment just carries on running as if we were never there.
Cool. And our last visit to conveyor.exe. So as every other one, everything is running smoothly. Conveyor.exe is happy. And we left it a really weirdly long time that time. So then we enable it. And this time we're not going to completely minimize the payment window because the victim in this scenario does pay. So just one last time over to conveyor.exe to show that everything is in fact running smoothly once it's all working, obviously. There we go. Everything is still working fine, but the victim's like, absolutely no chance. I'm not risking anything like that, so I'm going to pay. We give them the super secret key of 1234. They could have guessed that, to be fair. And we release the environment. It's disabled, the heartbeat stop, the alerts stop. And conveyor.exe lives to move boxes another day. Cool.
So I just want to emphasize that we've been showing you this attack from the perspective of the engineering workstation because that's where all the nice GUI elements are. But the engineering workstation at this point is just one node in that network, right? The rest of the network persists even without the engineering workstation once it's been deployed. It's organically self-sustaining. Whoops. Right, so what do we do in response to a threat like this?
So I hope a few people in here at least are going, this is really kind of easy to defend against. There are a number of steps along the way that are particularly easy to defend against, and absolutely they are. Unfortunately, if you've been in the OT environments that I have, no one does those things. So I want to talk you through some really mundane, basic hygiene more than best practice that would work to defend against Deadman's PLC prior to the deployment. The first is in like the network area. So obviously we're very focused on the network. And so the first thing is obviously to focus on network segregation. It's kind of like the main focus of operational technology, just keep things away. Also, just be scanning for unusual activity as well. It's kind of the best that you can do in certain situations. Then we move over to the engineering workstation, and these are just Windows devices. They may be very, very old, but they are just Windows devices. So you can do lots of things that do defend against against attacks against Windows devices. But engineering workstations sometimes have a very unique quality in that the configuration software can be configured such that that it only works if a USB stick license key is plugged into the machine. And that's basically like a second factor authentication. So if you don't have the USB stick in the machine, a remote attacker cannot do this. And finally, for the PLCs, unfortunately, resource-constrained devices and everything like that, it's very difficult to come up with some sort of defense against this. However, password protecting them, even if you're concerned about movers, joiners, movers, and leavers, and you want to rotate passwords and things like that, it's better to have it and to have the potential for an insider attack, because there is literally no disadvantage at that point, because you're protecting against some people at least. However.
So it should be clear that we can technically prevent this naive version of the attack that we've demonstrated here, right? Bearing in mind it's a concept attack. As far as we can tell, and we'd be very interested to hear opinions on this after the talk, as far as we can tell, once we've created the network with malicious accountability, once the botnet is deployed, and each one of those agents is sitting with its finger on a dead man switch, which is going to cause some sort of unwanted activity, at that point, we can't see how the plant manager wiggles out of it. We can't see how you reverse out of this. As far as we can tell, it's either pay the ransom or don't pay the ransom and see what happens when everything starts going off and on, or decide yourself to try and shut it down in as a controlled way as possible, and deal with what that means in your environment in terms of rebuilding, reflashing, and starting again from scratch. So what are the key takeaways? And again, we really want to be clear that what we're talking about here is a concept that changes the way we think about threat models in OT security. So with that in mind, the first thing we're going to say, having spent 40 minutes telling you to worry about this, is don't worry about it. Right? This is not the thing that is going to hurt us tomorrow. That's not the point of this talk. This is not malware that's now floating around in your environment. The thing we should be worrying about right now, as our data suggests, is the security and the resilience of our IT environments. Right? We want to stop that cyber extortion threat. And coincidentally, if we can stop that cyber extortion threat, we can also minimize the chances that an attacker is going to end up on our engineering workstation. However, I think what we've demonstrated is that the threat model for OT security will and can change when the right set of systemic conditions land, right? And with that in mind, we think there is a requirement to start thinking seriously about these kinds of problems. And the place to do that is by first understanding your own structures, responsibilities, your teams, by imagining how that, convergence between your IT and your OT people are going to work, by ensuring that you're tapping into the wisdom of your industrial experts, not just your IT experts, and by identifying and partnering with specialists or vendors that can actually add value and that have a long-term vision for you. And then I was talking in the beginning about the theory of crime, and one of the things that theory does is to try and describe the attributes of a suitable victim. So what makes one person or one situation or one business more likely to be a victim than another? And that framework, we call it VIVA. It's not a stutter, it is actually 2 V's. Is you firstly want to reduce your visibility, so make yourself less visible, and that's about reducing attack surface. And you'll have heard every speaker at this talk say that. Take it off the internet, sorry.
Josh, yesterday.
Yeah, Josh Corman was talking about it too.
His phrase was "get your shit off Shodan."
Yeah, he said you can't say
elegant
shit
phrase.
or Shodan, but get your shit off Shodan, which is really what that comes down to. You want to decrease vulnerability, and that's really just by improving basic cyber hygiene. Are you patching? Are you setting strong passwords? Are you detecting phishing mails? Those sorts of things. Then it gets a little more esoteric. You want to improve inertia. And in the 70s, the way they described it was by saying it's easier to steal a ring than a fridge. Thanks. So think about your environment and what would make it more heavy for the attacker to move things out of to take control of your environment. One example of that would be honeypots, right? It makes it more heavy. It's harder to find and take the thing away. You want to decrease the value of the asset to yourself, which is a crazy idea, but it's very powerful if you start to think about it. How can I make it so that if somebody else has this, it doesn't kill me? Right? How can I reduce my dependency on one instance of something? That's why backups work, and traditional cyber extortion. And then finally, we want to reduce access time. So how can we make sure that the attacker has the least amount of time possible to dick around on our engineering workstations?
Cool. So in the medium term, kind of like the defenses slide, unfortunately this is pretty mundane. It's basically pursue best practice cybersecurity controls in any way that your management will give you the budget for doing it. The two things that we kind of recommend are to develop your visibility and your capability for detecting weird traffic in your network. And also to have like robust incident response plans, but not just have those plans, to actually exercise them frequently, to understand what you're actually going to do and have them practiced. Because the worst thing that happens in an OT environment when things start going wrong is things start physically going wrong. And there is nothing that stops you thinking clearly than things going wrong physically. The other two are kind of similar, so they're kind of more focused on what's happening at the moment rather than thinking about a dead man's PLC style scenario. So minimize your OT's dependence on IT. So one of the reasons that we see so many IT ransomware attacks affecting OT is just because the OT has these dependencies in IT to keep running. So think about your systemic resilience through operational technology and try not to rely so much on that. And I know that's very difficult with IT-OT convergence and everything like that, but it's one of the things that is causing serious problems right now. And finally, I probably don't have to say this, but segregate your OT and IT. Have a good demilitarized zone, try and reduce that connectivity as much as possible, and really think about those zones and conduits throughout your OT.
All right, and then we had to do long-term takeaways also. RSA prescribes this, by the way. This is why you see it in all the talks. But I think the real thing that we're hoping to get with this conversation is that we start to think about what this demonstration means conceptually. And the first thing that it means conceptually is this is not an attack against the OT device. This is an attack against the internal software supply chain. Right? This is an attack on the CDCI, on the internal development environment. And I think that's an important shift in our thinking. The other important shift is that it's almost entirely living off the land. Right? If you were watching that OT environment with whatever your OT, IDS, IPS is, you're not going to see anything weird happening. We're just using the existing protocols, the existing tools, the existing functionality that's...
We've got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. And then I think the other thing is that we need to understand that concept that innovation in cyber happens when the outcome is innovated with, when the outcome evolves, right? That's what drives technical change. And we must be cautious not to get stuck on this idea of, like, for example, vulnerabilities and patching and ransomware and encryption. Those things are not going to shape the future of OT security. I mentioned already about thinking about the future and engaging with vendors. The vendors I'm talking about here are not the vendors at this conference. Well, some of them are at this conference.
They actually are.
Siemens is here, Rockwell is here. But I'm talking about the relationship and the pressure that we put on the people who are building these PLCs and those environments. This thing can be fixed at that level, and that's really where it should be fixed, rather than with us layering more and more technology on the top. 1 minute. And then finally, let's build secure by design. In conclusion, look, she's starting to look at us.
Do you want me to whip through these?
Yeah.
Okay, right, cool. Conclusions. 3 slides. Attacks on impact OT environments actually are increasing, but as a kind of IT ransomware cases, so it's not really that exciting, unfortunately. Viable modus operandi is actually all that cybercriminals need to start moving to attack operational technology, which is possible, as we've demonstrated today, without 0 days or exploits or anything exciting. And finally, good or best practice will prevent things like dead man's PLC deploying. Good cybersecurity hygiene is actually really effective for things like that. However, if you don't wait for that, if you just ignore that, not much can be done once it's deployed. Finally, thank you very much. Sorry for taking so long. Every meeting with Charles does take like this. if I may, one slight last plug for the material on screen. The top one is the actual Dead Man's PLC preprint. It's actually been accepted to Digital Threats Research and Practice, the journal. So we will have an official published version soon. And on the bottom, there is Security Navigator 2024, where we talk about OT attacks at page 107. So yeah, please. And come speak to us afterwards. Sorry we didn't leave time for questions. Thank you.